Yo ho, me hearties, and welcome to episode 18 of Herstory. And if you haven't gathered by my rather fetching hat, we're talking all things pirates today, and the subject of today's discussion is going to be fellow red-haired Irish pirates, general badass folk legend, Grace O'Malley. So today we are talking about Grace O'Malley, or Grania, as she is sometimes also called. Grania is the Irish name, and Grace is the kind of anglicised name. So not a lot is known about Grace O'Malley. She did definitely exist. She was definitely a real person. So the story that I'm going to tell is going to be fact interlinked with stories, legends, myths about her, but I will make it clear at each stage whether what I'm saying is true or whether it's a story. So Grania O'Malley, Grace O'Malley, is born in 1530 in Connaught in Ireland. Henry VIII is king at this point, and he holds the title of the Lord of Ireland, but just tends to let the Irish princes and lords and clans just leaves them to their own devices, basically. Her father is Ewan Dodara O'Malley, Lord of the O'Malley dynasty, and they're based in Clough Bay in County Mayo, which is on the west coast of the north of Ireland. They're a seafaring family of Connaught, and they built a row of castles facing the sea to protect their territory. They make their money by fishing, by trading in raw materials, and by piracy, basically. Her mother, Margaret or Maeve, was also an O'Malley, so they were distantly related somehow, mother and father. And Grace was their only child, but she did have an illegitimate half-brother called Donald, who will crop up later in our story. So according to local folklore, as a young girl, Grace wanted to go on a trading expedition to Spain with her father, but he said no because her long hair would get caught in the ship's rigging. So she cut all of her hair off and earned herself the nickname Grania Moyol, which I find very hard to say. Grania Moyol, Moyol meaning bald or short-haired. So her dad nicknamed her the bald one, basically. As a child, she most likely lived at her family's residence of Belclare and Clare Island, and was almost certainly formally educated. We know that she could speak Latin at least. In 1546, at the age of 16, she's married to Donald O'Flaherty, who's a hot-headed and impetuous man who likes to start fights, and Grace largely assumed chieftainship of the O'Flahertys while he was off causing arguments and causing trouble, basically. They were a good political match, though. They had 3 children together, Owen, Maeve and Murroch. In 1565, Donald, her husband, the husband, not the brother, Donald was killed in an ambush while hunting in the hills as part of a struggle with the Joyce clan for control over a castle called Cox Castle. Grace then takes that castle, besieges that castle in revenge for her husband's death, claims it as her own, and changes the name of the castle to Hen's Castle, which I think is very cool. Grace returned home and she established her principal residence on Clare Island and allegedly took in a Spanish shipwrecked sailor as her lover. Now you got to remember, England are at war with Spain at this point, right? So this is the tensions between England and Ireland are not great, and then she goes and takes a Spanish lover. No ideal. The affair was very brief because he was killed by the MacMahon clan of Ballyvoy. Seeking vengeance for his death, Grace attacked the MacMahon castle of Doona in Blacksod Bay, killed her lover's murderers on Carhill Island, and earned her other nickname, the Dark Lady of Doona. In 1566, she married Iron Richard Burke, a notorious Irish rebel. They had a son called Tibbet. Toby or Theobald is the anglicised version, Tibbet. But Grania wasn't finished with Castle Doona yet. She attacked again and took the castle for herself. So she moved into her second husband, Richard's castle at Rockfleet, and this is her castle for the rest of her days. Now this is where she kind of chooses to spend the rest of her time. Apparently her second marriage to Richard was more of an alliance than a love affair. After only a year together, Richard is reputed to have returned home to find his clothes packed, doors locked, and Grace dismissing him from the battlements and saying, "Begone, I dismiss you," which in Irish clan law was the equivalent of divorce. But they did kind of reconcile and get on well together, and they fought well together as allies until he died in 1583. So some good kind of came out of it. But she kept his castle for herself when he died. Even though they weren't technically married. Another story says that their son Tibbet was born aboard a ship. The ship was attacked the next day by Algerian corsairs, and Grace got up out of her bed and helped fight them off with 2 blunderbusses. Very cool. So there we go. So in 1566, and she's married Richard. By this time, Elizabeth I is on the throne, and she wants Ireland under, not necessarily under English rule, but she wants to kind of consolidate the two countries, as it were. And Henry VIII started this tradition of something called surrender and re-grant, which was a legal mechanism by which Irish clan chieftains would surrender their lands and pledge allegiance to the king, or in Elizabeth's case the queen, and then they would have their lands re-granted to them. So it's moving the structure more from a clan-based system to more of an English feudalist system. My throat's really dry. In 1576, Grace does this with Lord Deputy Sir Henry Sidney, and they form a kind of shaky truce. He's quite impressed by her. One of the accounts we have of her is written by Sir Henry Sidney. So what I've done is I've written the facts and then I've written the story, so I'm like going backwards and forwards with my notes. But here we go. So she's with Henry Sidney, and then Henry Sidney, I'm trying to find the date when he was appointed, but I can't. Here we go. 1584. A man called Sir Richard Bingham is made the provincial president of Connaught, which is Grace's territory, right? So like the governors in the West Indies and stuff like that. That's a very fetching hat, I must say. like the governors in the West Indies and things like that. He's made the governor of Connaught, so he's basically made the governor of her territory, and obviously she doesn't like that very much. Apparently Bingham really focused on Grace as a source of trouble and insurrection and rebellion in the Crown's efforts to control Ireland, and he orders his brother John to seize the lands of Grace's son Owen, her oldest son. Owen offered hospitality to John, but was murdered anyway. Nice. Incensed by this, naturally, Grace became an active rebel against Bingham, who then dispatched his brother John, always getting his brother to do stuff, dispatched John to seize her and her property. She flees to Ulster and remained there in exile for 3 months due to storm damage to her fleet. Later in 1587, Bingham sent to Flanders to aid the Dutch against Spain, and things calmed down a little bit. Grace goes to see Lord Deputy Sir John Perrot. Really sorry, go get a drink. Oh, dear, I coughed so hard I made my eyes water. Sorry. Not a fitting look for a pirate to be crying. No, no, no. Okay, where were we? In 1589, yes, he goes to Flanders to aid the Dutch against Spain, and everything calms down for a little while. Grace goes to see Lord Deputy Sir John Perrot, who pardons her and her children for all of their past offences and hopes to create another kind of shaky truce. But 2 years later, in 1589, Bingham returns. Perrot is replaced, and Bingham is coming for Grace. Oh dear. And this war rages on for years and years. In 1592, Tibbot, her youngest son, rises up and attacks Bingham, but he impounds I couldn't read my own writing. He impounds her fleet, takes her property, and she's left with no choice but to do something very cunning and very clever, which I found very impressive. So in 1592, Tibbot, Moreau, her other son, and her half-brother Donald were taken captive by English Governor of Connaught, Sir Richard Bingham. And what Grace does is sails to England to petition Queen Elizabeth I, Richard Bingham's mistress, for their release. She stayed with Black Tom, the Earl of Ormond, who was a member of court. She generally hung around court for a few months, being a bit of a nuisance and kind of demanding an audience with Elizabeth. Oh, I got really sorry, I think I'm going down with something. And the Earl of Ormond put in a good word for her, and basically what happened was Elizabeth sent her a letter containing 18 questions, and Grace then sent back the answer to those 18 questions, and after that Elizabeth agreed to meet with her face to face, which is pretty amazing. I did not know. The Elizabeth I expert did not know this. So Grace met with Elizabeth I face to face in person at Greenwich Palace. We know that Elizabeth was wearing a fine gown and was surrounded by guards and members of the court. We know their discussion was carried out in Latin because Elizabeth did not speak Irish and Grace did not speak English. And they reached an agreement at the end of the discussion whereby Elizabeth would remove Bingham from post and give Grace back her lands, her sons, her cattle, her ships, everything that had been lost. And in return, Grace would stop supporting the Irish Lords' rebellion. Now, the rest of the meeting is conjecture and story and theory. Some people say that Grace was wearing a fine gown. Some people say that she was barefoot and she was wearing traditional Irish dress. Some say that Grace refused to bow to Elizabeth because she didn't recognise her as Queen of Ireland, only Queen Some say Grace had a dagger upon her personage, which was taken off of her by Elizabeth's guards when she was searched, and she said, oh no, it's not because I want to harm the Queen, it's because I want to protect myself. And Elizabeth said it's okay, just allow her to keep it on her. There is also a story that she came with a load of chieftains, took a load of Irish chieftains with her. There's also a story which is highly probably untrue, that at one point Grace started sneezing. During the meeting, Grace started sneezing, and Elizabeth passed her handkerchief to use, and Grace thanked her for that, and she blew her nose, and then she threw the handkerchief on the fire, which was customary to do in Irish tradition, because it's a soiled hanky, you wouldn't want to use it again, but in English custom that's extremely rude, and it's a gift from the Queen and you've just thrown it in the fire. Probably highly untrue. All the accounts that come out of this meeting with Elizabeth I, which we know happened, this is a fact, all the accounts that come out of this meeting tend to portray Grace as impudent and a bit of a savage, basically. Yeah, like just get in your place kind of thing. But Liz agrees to see her, they talk, and she gets her son, her lands, and her property back. She comes home a heroine and with a full pardon, so she must have done something right. Very quickly, Elizabeth and Grace both kind of realise that this shaky truce is not gonna go amazingly, because Bingham has still got it in for Grace. So yeah, Liz pardoned all her charges, dismissing Grace's activities as she hath lived out of order, ordered the release of Tibbet, and monies from her son's estate. Tibbet goes on to become Viscount Mayo under James I, be given to Grace as a pension. They were around the same age, they were both women in the men's world, and they were both used to getting their way. So I think both the two redheads had a lot more in common than they thought they did, and they got on a lot better than they thought they did, and they kind of respected the queen-like demeanour of the other. So yeah, the meeting goes well, but they quickly realise that this is not going to work with Bingham in the equation. Go back. Here we go. Grace goes back to supporting Irish insurgents during what's known as the 9 Years' War, and it's here she earns her really fearsome reputation as a female pirate. She commanded the ship called the White Seahorse. She owned a fleet of galleys, which are quite large ships. They were said to be the only fleet of galley ships on the Irish coast. She traded raw materials for luxury goods, fished, plundered, and levied a toll on all ships in her waters. So she'd do things like loot shipwrecks and attack ships that came into her waters, and just generally be a little bit of a nuisance. She was quite a double-sided woman. Like, on land she was refined and she was respectable, and she was kind of feigning a truce with England, and at sea she was an absolute bloody menace. Which I love. She died at Rockfleet Castle around 1603, which is also the year that Elizabeth died, which I think is uncanny. And she was probably buried with her family at Clare Island Abbey. So that is the story. Now on to the fun facts. Documentary evidence of Grace's life comes mostly from English sources. She seems to have been written out of Irish history almost completely. The Irish Annals of the Four Masters, which are basically the book of the clansmen, include both of her husbands in great detail, where they were born, where they died, all that kind of thing, but not her. She seems to have been written out purely for the fact that she was a woman, but there are a lot of accounts English accounts from Sir Henry Sidney and from people that were around when she met with Queen Elizabeth, people that encountered her at sea, talking about her, and they all use the same name, Gronio O'Malley. So we know she existed, and the last account of her, I believe, is in 1601, where a merchant ship crosses paths with her and documents that. So yeah, everything we have of her is pretty much an English source, so we have to take it with a little pinch of salt. But there you go. And the 18 questions that Queen Elizabeth sent to Grace and the responses that Grace sent back to Elizabeth are available to go and view at the National Archives in Kew, which I just found out, which is really freaking cool. I might have to go and have a look at that next time I'm in there. There are no contemporary images of her. We don't have a picture of her. There seems to be this persistent idea, myth, whatever, that she was a redhead. I can't find any evidence of that, but I have only done some cursory research for this episode. I am by no means an expert on Grace O'Malley, so I'm inclined to believe the people that have done their research, but I can't find any contemporary reports of her as being redheaded. There's a story of her recorded of her chiding her son Tibbot in the course of an attack on Cunturk Castle, where she thought he was shirking the battle, and she said to me, "Are you trying to hide in my arse or the place you came out of?" Which I thought was quite funny. In 1985, Irish composer Sean Davey composed a suite of music based on her life. There was a Broadway musical called The Pirate Queen, which debuted in 2007. Debuted in 2007. There are statues of her outside Westport House in County Mayo and outside a church in Chicago, weirdly enough. The scale of her pirate activities is difficult to assess. She has been credited with attacks from Donegal all the way to Waterford, though. One story tells how the Earl of Howth refused her hospitality, so she kidnapped his heir and demanded as a ransom payment that an extra place be set at every meal for her at Howth Castle every night. It was quite amusing. Estimates vary as to the number of ships she held. It's thought she held between 5 and 20 galleys at any one time. So, what else have we got? Yes, the last official record of Grace is in 1601 when a merchant ship crossed paths with her. And I think that's it. I think that's everything. That is everything we have on Grace O'Malley. So if you want to go and read a bit more about Grace O'Malley, there is a biography written about her by a lady called Anne Chambers, who is the authority on Grace O'Malley. There is a passing mention of her in one of my absolute favourite books called Under the Black Flag, The Romance and Reality of Life Among the Pirates by David Cordingley. It's a fantastic book. You can see it's been very well thumbed. I took this on holiday to Cuba with me so that I could read about pirates in the Caribbean. Absolutely love this book. It's just a really good read. But there's a whole chapter on female pirates in there, and Grace features in there. Obviously, yeah, there's her biography written by Anne Chambers, and if you want to learn more about female pirates in general, piracy and life on the high seas, these are two books that I would highly recommend. Another one by David Cordingley called Heroines and Harlots, Women at Sea in the Great Age of Sail, which I absolutely love. And this one, which is the Bible on pirate history, the general history of the robberies and murders of the most notorious pirates by Captain Charles Johnson. Now, this was written a very, very long time ago. When was it written? May 1724. So it's been updated and abridged and made suitable for a modern readership by none other than David Cordingley. There's a theme here. So basically, I would recommend any book by David Cordingley. So there you go. There is your reading list. But I highly recommend Under the Black Flag. It is a really good read, and it will keep you entertained. So that is it. That's Grace O'Malley. Sorry, I've been a little bit like off and on with videos lately. I've been writing an essay for my master's, and I'm finishing up my job at Itworth. My contract's finishing, so as of October I am going to be out of a job, and I'm going to really focus on Herstory and my master's degree. So there we go, exciting things coming up. There is a poll over on the Facebook page for who you would like to see in the next episode of Herstory. Trying to remember who it is. I think it's Cthulhan and Vicantus, something like that. So yeah, please do keep an eye on the Facebook page or to have your say over who the next episode is going to be about, and I shall see you next week for another installment of Herstory.